Why does no one ever leave my hometown after turning 18? My brother Kyle packed his car 3 years ago with everything he owned, hugged me goodbye, and drove toward college in Seattle. He made it 6 hours before he turned around and came home. He told our parents he realized Millbrook was where he belonged, that leaving felt wrong, that he wanted to stay close to family. But I saw his face when he walked back through the door. He looked terrified and confused, like he couldn't quite remember why he'd come back or what had changed his mind during that drive. Within a week, he had a job at the lumber mill and an apartment on Cedar Street, and he stopped talking about college completely. Every time I asked him what happened, he got this distant look and said he was happy here, and I'd understand when I was older. I'm 17 now, turning 18 in 3 weeks, and I've been counting. In the past 5 years, 47 kids graduated from Millbrook High School, and all 47 still live within town limits. Some went to the community college for a semester and dropped out. Others got jobs right away at the mill or the grocery store or the gas station. A few got married immediately after graduation, but none of them left for real, and that can't be normal. I started keeping a list in my notebook 2 months ago, documenting everyone I could remember from recent graduating classes and checking where they ended up. Amber Holloway had a full scholarship to study engineering at Stanford, but she came back after orientation and now works as a cashier at the drugstore. Daniel Pierce got accepted to the Air Force Academy and was supposed to leave for basic training, but he never showed up and instead joined his father's construction company. Lisa Chen was going to study abroad in France through a special program, but she canceled 2 days before her flight and enrolled at Millbrook Community College, dropping out by winter break. I talked to each of them, asking what changed their minds, and they all gave me the same vague answers about feeling like they belonged here and not wanting to leave family, and realizing their dreams could be smaller and more practical. But their eyes told different stories, showed confusion and frustration buried under whatever made them give up and settle for lives they never wanted. I drove to the county library in the next town over to search newspaper archives for stories about Millbrook, anything that might explain this pattern. The librarian helped me access digital records going back 30 years, and I spent 6 hours scrolling through articles about town council meetings and high school sports and business openings. What I found was a pattern in the population data published every year in the county report. For the past 25 years, Millbrook's population has stayed almost exactly the same, right around 3,000 people, even though birth rates should have caused growth, or young people leaving should have caused decline. The number of 18-year-olds living in town each year matched perfectly with the number of babies born 18 years earlier, minus a handful who died in accidents or moved away with their families before turning 18. Every single person who turned 18 while living in Millbrook stayed in Millbrook, and that included kids whose families had only moved to town when they were 16 or 17. The pattern was so consistent, it looked deliberate. My girlfriend Natalie graduates this spring, 2 months before I do, and she's been talking about college applications since freshman year. She wants to study marine biology and has been accepted to 3 schools on the coast, all of them giving her enough financial aid that she can actually afford to go. We spent last weekend looking at dorm room setups on her laptop and planning how often I could visit after I graduated. But yesterday she told me she's not going anymore, that she's been thinking about it, and college seems like a waste of money when she could work at her mom's bakery and take over the business eventually. I asked her when this change happened, and she couldn't give me a specific answer, just said she'd been feeling different lately about her priorities. Her 18th birthday was last week, and I'd been with her the whole day, watching her blow out candles on a cake her mom made and open presents with her family. She seemed normal then, excited about her future and counting down until graduation. Something changed after that birthday, and the shift was too sudden and too similar to everyone else who gave up their dreams right after turning 18. I went to the town hall during lunch break and asked to see public records about local businesses and employment statistics. The clerk seemed surprised anyone my age cared about boring government documents, but she showed me to a room with filing cabinets full of records. I photographed pages with my phone, focusing on tax records and business registrations, trying to find connections between the companies that employed all these young people who stayed. Millbrook has maybe 20 major employers, including the lumber mill that employs about 60 people, the packaging plant with 40 workers, 3 gas stations, 2 grocery stores, the hospital, the school system, and various smaller retail shops. What stood out was how many 18 to 25-year-olds worked at these places for wages barely above minimum, doing jobs that should have high turnover, but somehow kept the same workers year after year. The mill had kids working dangerous machinery for $12 an hour when they could make twice that in the city. The hospital had young people doing cleaning and food service instead of pursuing medical careers they'd trained for in high school programs. I found Kyle at the mill during his lunch break and brought him a sandwich, hoping to catch him away from other workers so he might actually talk to me. He sat on a stack of lumber pallets and ate quietly, while I asked him directly what happened during that drive to Seattle 3 years ago. He chewed slowly and stared at the ground, his face showing the same confusion I'd seen when he first came back. He said he remembered feeling excited for the first few hours, singing along to music and thinking about his dorm room and new classes. Then, somewhere near the state line, he started feeling sick and dizzy, like the worst flu hitting him all at once. He pulled over at a rest stop and sat in his car for an hour, and during that time all he could think about was that he needed to go home. Not wanted to go home, but needed to, like his body wouldn't function properly unless he turned around. He couldn't explain why the feeling was so strong or where it came from, but it was overwhelming enough that he drove straight back to Millbrook, and the sickness disappeared the moment he crossed back into town limits. That same afternoon, I called my Aunt Rachel, who grew up in Millbrook, but moved away 30 years ago. She lives in Oregon now, and visits every few years for holidays. I asked her directly if she'd ever noticed anything strange about young people staying in town, and she was quiet for a long time before answering. She told me she left for college when she was 17, a year early because she'd skipped a grade, and that she thinks leaving before turning 18 was the only reason she got away. She said she remembered friends who tried to leave after graduation and came back within days, talking about feeling homesick and missing family. But their explanations never made sense because these were kids who'd been desperate to escape Millbrook their whole lives. She never figured out why it happened, just knew she'd gotten lucky by leaving early. When I asked if she ever came back for her 18th birthday, she said no. She'd made sure to stay away that whole year and her parents had visited her instead. Something in her voice suggested she'd suspected something was wrong even back then, but never had proof. I started watching Dr. Harmon more carefully after that conversation. He's been the town's main doctor for 30 years, running the clinic where everyone goes for checkups and vaccinations and prescription refills. Every kid in Millbrook has an appointment with Dr. Harmon right around their 18th birthday for what he calls a standard wellness exam required for adult health records. The appointment is free and supposedly covers things like vaccination updates and basic health screening. Natalie had her appointment 2 days before her birthday, and I'd driven her there and waited in the parking lot. She'd gone in acting normal and come out seeming fine, but that was also right before she started talking differently about her future. I pulled up my own appointment reminder on my phone and saw I was scheduled for my wellness exam in 2 weeks, 5 days, before my 18th birthday. The timing seemed too precise to be coincidental, and I remembered Kyle mentioning he'd had his wellness exam right before that failed attempt to leave for Seattle. I made a list of questions I needed answers to, and the first one was what actually happened during those wellness exams. I couldn't exactly break into Dr. Harmon's clinic to look at medical records, but I could talk to people who worked there and see if anyone would tell me what the exams involved. The clinic employed 3 nurses, all of them women in their 50s or 60s who'd worked there for decades. I went to the grocery store and found Nurse Patricia shopping after her shift, and I approached her carefully, pretending I was nervous about my upcoming exam and wanted to know what to expect. She smiled and said it was just basic stuff, taking vital signs and doing a quick physical, and that Dr. Harmon would give me a vaccination booster that everyone needed at 18. I asked what the booster was for, and she hesitated before saying something about immunity support for adulthood. Her answer was vague enough to make me suspicious, and when I pressed for details about which diseases the vaccine protected against, she said I should ask Dr. Harmon directly during my appointment. I went to the library and used their computers to research standard vaccinations for 18-year-olds. There weren't any. Most vaccinations happened in childhood or early teens, and while some boosters were recommended in late adolescence, nothing was standard or required specifically at 18. I searched medical databases and public health websites and found nothing that matched what Nurse Patricia had described. I also searched for any kind of medication or treatment that could affect someone's desire to stay in a specific location. And while I found information about how certain drugs could affect decision-making or motivation, nothing explained the specific pattern I was seeing in Millbrook. The closest thing was research on how some psychiatric medications could reduce initiative or ambition, but those required ongoing doses and would show obvious side effects. Whatever was happening in Millbrook was more precise and more targeted than anything I could find in legitimate medical literature. The town's high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Fletcher, called me into her office to discuss my post-graduation plans. I'd been avoiding these meetings because I didn't want to lie about my intentions to leave, but I also didn't want to draw attention by refusing to show up. She asked about my college applications and seemed pleased when I told her I'd applied to several schools and was waiting to hear back. She talked about how exciting it was to pursue education beyond high school and how proud she was of students who set ambitious goals. But then she mentioned that many students found themselves reconsidering their plans after graduation, choosing to stay close to home, where they had support systems and familiar opportunities. She said this wasn't failure or giving up, just maturity and realistic thinking about what actually mattered in life. The whole conversation felt like preparation, like she was already setting up the narrative for when I inevitably stayed in Millbrook like everyone else. I left her office feeling sick and more determined than ever to figure out what was really happening. That night, I drove to the rest stop where Kyle said he'd felt sick and turned around. It was about 3 hours from Millbrook, right at the point where the highway split toward different cities. I sat in my car and tried to imagine what could make someone feel so sick they'd abandon their dreams and drive home. Nothing about the location seemed special or significant. It was just a standard rest area with bathrooms and vending machines and picnic tables. I walked around taking photos and looking for anything unusual, but there was nothing. I got back in my car and kept driving, passing the rest stop and continuing another hour toward the nearest city. I felt fine the whole time, no dizziness or nausea or overwhelming need to turn around. But I was still 17, and according to the pattern I'd documented, the effect only started after people turned 18. Whatever was making people come back wasn't tied to the location they left from, but to something that happened before they tried to leave. I needed to talk to someone who'd successfully left Millbrook after turning 18, and after hours of searching through social media and old yearbooks, I found exactly one person who fit that description. Her name was Megan Foster, and she'd graduated 8 years ago and now lived in Denver working as a graphic designer. I found her professional website and sent her an email explaining who I was and asking if she'd be willing to talk about her experience leaving Millbrook. She responded within hours, saying yes and giving me her phone number. When I called her that evening from my car parked behind the grocery store where no one would overhear, she told me she'd only managed to leave because she'd skipped her wellness exam. She'd been suspicious of the appointment because her older sister had gone through the same thing and came back different afterward, less ambitious and more accepting of staying in town. Megan had faked a family emergency the day of her scheduled exam and left town the next morning without telling anyone, driving straight to Denver where she stayed with a cousin. Megan said the first few months were hard because she kept getting calls from Dr. Harmon's office trying to reschedule her wellness exam, claiming it was important for her health records and that she needed to complete it even if she lived elsewhere. They offered to send her vaccination records to a doctor in Denver if she came back for just one appointment, making it sound urgent and medically necessary. She never went back, and eventually the calls stopped, but she said she still felt uncomfortable visiting Millbrook even now, like something about the town made her anxious. She'd figured out that the wellness exam was the key moment when something happened to keep people there, but she didn't know what the doctors actually did during those appointments or what they injected into people. She'd tried to file a complaint with state health authorities, but without proof or medical records, they dismissed her concerns as paranoia. She told me to document everything I could before my 18th birthday and to leave town before my scheduled appointment if I wanted any chance of escaping. I spent the next week watching Dr. Harmon's clinic from different locations around town, noting the patterns of who came and went. Every afternoon, there were at least 2 or 3 teenagers coming in for their wellness exams, all of them right around their 18th birthdays, based on calculations from birth announcements in old newspapers I'd found. The appointments typically lasted about 30 minutes, and the kids always looked fine going in and coming out. No obvious distress or visible injuries or signs that anything wrong had happened. But I started paying attention to these same kids over the following weeks, watching how their behavior changed after their appointments. They started talking differently about their futures, mentioning how they'd been thinking about staying close to home or reconsidering their college plans. The shift was gradual enough that parents and friends probably didn't notice, but once I knew what to look for, the pattern was obvious and consistent. Something in that exam room was changing how these kids thought about leaving town. I needed to see inside one of those wellness exams, and the only way to do that was to find someone who'd go in wearing a hidden camera. I bought a small camera designed to look like a shirt button from an online electronics store, using money I'd saved from my job at the hardware store. The camera could record up to 2 hours of video and audio to a memory card, and it was small enough that no one would notice it. I needed someone who had an exam scheduled and was willing to help me, someone who understood that something wrong was happening and wanted proof. I thought about asking Natalie, but her exam had already happened, and she was already showing signs of whatever they'd done to her. I needed someone who hadn't turned 18 yet, someone who still had the critical thinking and suspicion intact. I found exactly that person in Devin Wright, a junior who'd skipped 2 grades and was turning 18 next month while still in 11th grade. He was smart enough to see that the pattern was wrong and brave enough to help me document it. Devin agreed to wear the camera to his wellness exam after I showed him my research and explained what I'd discovered. He understood the risk that he might be affected by whatever happened during the appointment, but he said getting proof was worth it if it meant helping other people escape. We practiced positioning the camera on his shirt in a way that would capture everything while looking natural, and we tested the audio quality to make sure it would pick up conversations clearly. His appointment was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, and I waited in my car in the clinic parking lot while he went inside. I watched the clock and tried not to panic, knowing that if my theory was right, Devin might come out of that building fundamentally changed from whoever he'd been going in. 35 minutes later, he walked out looking normal, got in his car, and drove away. I followed him to the library where we'd agreed to meet, and we went to a private study room where he transferred the video file to my laptop. The video showed Devin sitting on an exam table while Dr. Harmon reviewed a clipboard and asked standard health questions about allergies and medications and family, medical history. Everything seemed completely normal for the first 10 minutes. Then Dr. Harmon left the room briefly and came back with a small tray holding a syringe filled with clear liquid. He explained this was the immunity booster everyone received at 18, a special formulation developed specifically for Millbrook residents based on local environmental factors and water quality. Devin asked what was in the vaccine, and Dr. Harmon gave a vague answer about proprietary ingredients and standard immunity support compounds. He swabbed Devin's upper arm with alcohol and administered the injection quickly, disposing of the syringe in a sharps container. Then, he had Devin sit quietly for 15 minutes while he observed for any immediate reactions, using that time to talk about Devin's plans for the future. The doctor asked about college and career goals, and when Devin mentioned wanting to study physics at a university out of state, Dr. Harmon started subtly suggesting that staying close to home might be more practical and fulfilling. The most disturbing part of the video came during those final 15 minutes. Dr. Harmon spoke in a low, steady voice about how Millbrook was a special place where people took care of each other and how leaving often led to loneliness and regret. He talked about success and happiness being about community and belonging rather than achievement and ambition. He mentioned how many young people tried to leave and came back because they realized home was where they needed to be. His words weren't overtly threatening or manipulative, but something about the combination of the injection and the doctor's voice seemed designed to work together. Devin's expression in the video shifted during those minutes, his initial confidence fading into something more uncertain and passive. By the time the appointment ended and Devin left the exam room, you could see the change in his body language, the way he moved more slowly and seemed less sure of himself. I stopped the video and looked at Devin sitting next to me in the library study room, and I could see that same uncertainty in his face now. Devin said he felt strange after the injection, like his thoughts were moving through fog and taking longer to form than they should. He said he'd had clear plans and goals when he walked into the clinic, but now those plans felt less important somehow, less urgent. He could still remember wanting to study physics and leave Millbrook, but the emotions attached to those goals had flattened out, replaced by a vague sense that maybe staying wouldn't be so bad. He was scared by how quickly his perspective had shifted and by how reasonable the doctor's suggestions had seemed in the moment. We both understood that whatever was in that injection was changing something fundamental about how people thought and felt about leaving town. This wasn't just persuasion or social pressure. This was chemical manipulation designed to keep young people trapped in Millbrook permanently. I saved 3 copies of the video file to different locations and uploaded one to a secure cloud storage account, knowing this evidence was too important to risk losing. I spent that night researching medications and chemicals that could affect motivation and decision-making in the specific way I'd observed. The most likely candidates were certain types of psychiatric medications that altered dopamine levels and affected the brain's reward system. Some antipsychotic medications could reduce initiative and motivation as side effects, and certain experimental drugs had been tested for treating addiction by reducing cravings and desire for specific behaviors. But nothing I found was supposed to be given to healthy teenagers without consent, and nothing was designed specifically to make people want to stay in one geographic location. Whatever Dr. Harmon was injecting required either a custom formulation or a combination of existing drugs used in ways that weren't approved or legal. I needed to get a sample of the injection fluid and have it analyzed by someone who could identify the components. The only way to do that was to somehow get into the clinic and access the supply they kept for the wellness exams. The clinic closed at 6 in the evening on weekdays, and Dr. Harmon usually left by 6:30. I watched from my car as the staff finished their shifts and locked up, waiting until the parking lot was empty and the building was dark. Breaking into a medical clinic felt insane and criminal, but I couldn't think of any legal way to get what I needed. I waited until midnight and then approached the back entrance wearing dark clothes and gloves. The door was locked, but the window next to it was old and had a loose frame. I managed to pry it open quietly and climbed through into a storage room filled with medical supplies and cleaning equipment. I used my phone flashlight to navigate through the dark building, moving carefully to avoid knocking anything over or triggering any alarms. The exam rooms were down a hallway, and I checked each one until I found the refrigerator where vaccines and medications were stored. Inside were dozens of small vials labeled with codes and dates, and I found a whole shelf dedicated to vials marked with just the number 18 and batch numbers. I took 2 vials from the back of the shelf, hoping they wouldn't be missed immediately, and wrapped them carefully in a towel before putting them in my jacket pocket. I photographed the inside of the refrigerator and the labels on other medications, documenting everything I could see. Then I searched Dr. Harmon's office and found his computer, but it was password protected, and I couldn't access his files. I did find a filing cabinet that wasn't locked, and inside were medical records for Millbrook residents organized by age. I pulled the files for everyone who'd had wellness exams in the past year and photographed the pages with my phone, capturing notes about the injections and follow-up observations. The records showed that Dr. Harmon tracked patients after their wellness exams for several months, noting changes in behavior and plans, and making adjustments to doses if needed. Some patients received additional injections in the months following their 18th birthday if they showed signs of wanting to leave town. The documentation was clinical and detailed, treating the suppression of these kids' ambitions as a medical treatment rather than a crime. I left the clinic the same way I came in, climbing out the window and walking quickly back to my car parked 3 blocks away. My hands were shaking as I drove home, and I kept checking my mirrors to make sure no one was following me. I hid the vials in the back of my closet behind old textbooks and transferred all the photos from my phone to my laptop and 2 separate USB drives. I had evidence now, solid proof that something criminal was happening in Millbrook, but I didn't know who to trust with that information. The local police chief had grown up in Millbrook and was friends with Dr. Harmon. The mayor had lived here her whole life and probably knew what was happening. The school administration worked closely with the clinic and referred students for their wellness exams. Everyone with authority in town seemed to be part of whatever system had been operating here for decades. I needed to contact someone outside Millbrook, someone with power to investigate and shut down what was happening. I researched which state agencies handled medical crimes and public health violations, and I found contact information for the State Medical Board and the Attorney General's office. I also found the number for the FBI field office that covered our region, thinking federal involvement might be necessary given the scope of what I'd discovered. I spent hours writing a detailed report explaining everything I'd found, including the population data showing impossible retention rates, the testimony from Megan and my brother Kyle, the video from Devin's exam, the photos from the clinic break-in, and my own analysis of how the system worked. I sent encrypted emails to all 3 agencies at once, attaching documentation and requesting immediate investigation. Then I waited, checking my email every few minutes and hoping someone would take me seriously, despite being a 17-year-old kid making incredible accusations against small-town medical professionals. The state medical board responded first, 2 days later, saying they'd received my complaint and would review it according to their procedures. The message was formal and bureaucratic, giving no indication of how seriously they took the allegations or how quickly they'd act. The Attorney General's office sent an automated response saying my message had been received and someone would contact me if additional information was needed. The FBI didn't respond at all. I felt like I was screaming into a void while my 18th birthday got closer and closer. I had 13 days left before my scheduled wellness exam, and if the authorities didn't move fast enough, I'd either have to run like Megan had or let them inject me with whatever substance they used to keep people trapped here. Neither option seemed acceptable when I had evidence that could potentially free everyone in Millbrook and prevent this from happening to future generations. Devin called me 3 days after his wellness exam to say he wasn't going to help anymore. His voice was flat and distant, completely different from the determined person who'd agreed to wear the hidden camera. He said he'd been thinking about his priorities and decided that getting involved in conspiracy theories wasn't a good use of his time. He needed to focus on school and family and his future in Millbrook, not waste energy on paranoid investigations that probably wouldn't lead anywhere. I tried to argue with him and remind him of what he'd seen and experienced, but he cut me off and said he didn't want to discuss it further. This was exactly what happened to everyone else after their wellness exams, the sudden shift from questioning the system to accepting it completely. Devin had been my ally and proof that someone else saw what I saw, and now he was just another victim I couldn't save. I felt more alone than ever, racing against time with evidence that powerful people had every reason to suppress or destroy. I started preparing to leave Millbrook on my own, gathering supplies and money and making plans for where I could go. I had about $3,000 saved from 2 years of working at the hardware store, enough to get me started somewhere else if I was careful. I researched cities with good job opportunities and low costs of living, places where I could survive while figuring out my next steps. But leaving felt like abandoning everyone else still trapped here, including my brother and my former girlfriend and hundreds of other young people who'd had their futures stolen by a system that treated them as resources to be controlled. I kept hoping the authorities would act before I had to make that choice, that state investigators would show up and shut down the clinic and arrest everyone involved. My email inbox stayed empty, except for automated messages and spam. No one was coming to help. My mom noticed I was acting different and asked if something was wrong. I wanted to tell her everything, but I didn't know if she was part of the system or just another victim who'd never questioned it. She'd grown up in Millbrook and never left, marrying my dad who'd also grown up here. They both seemed happy with their lives, running a small accounting business and raising their kids in the same town where they'd been raised. Had they gone through wellness exams too? Had they been injected with substances that made them content to stay? Or had they chosen this life freely and never noticed what was happening to their own son when he came back from his failed college attempt? I didn't know how deep the manipulation went or who I could trust, so I told her I was just stressed about college applications and graduation planning. She hugged me and said everything would work out fine, that I'd find my path whether it led away from Millbrook or kept me close to home. Her words felt ominous given everything I knew. I went back to the library in the next town and used their computers to research similar cases in other places, searching for reports of towns or communities where young people mysteriously stayed instead of leaving. I found a few academic papers about brain drain in rural areas and the social factors that kept young people in small towns, but nothing that matched the deliberate and systematic control I'd documented in Millbrook. I expanded my search to include medical conspiracies and unauthorized drug trials, finding some historical cases where doctors had experimented on patients without consent. The Tuskegee syphilis study and various pharmaceutical company scandals showed that medical professionals could absolutely commit crimes against vulnerable populations if they thought they could get away with it. But I couldn't find any modern cases of an entire town being medicated to control their behavior. Millbrook seemed unique in the scope and duration of what was happening, which made me worry even more that authorities wouldn't believe me or act quickly enough. I received an email on Thursday morning from someone at the Attorney General's office asking me to call a specific number and reference a case file number. My hands were shaking as I dialed from a payphone outside the grocery store, not wanting to use my cell phone in case someone was monitoring it. A woman answered and identified herself as Investigator Linda Ramos from the State Criminal Investigation Division. She said she'd reviewed my complaint and supporting evidence. And while some of my claims seemed extraordinary, the video from the clinic exam and the photos of medical records were concerning enough to warrant preliminary investigation. She wanted to know if I could provide the actual vials I'd taken from the clinic so they could be analyzed by state toxicologists. I told her yes and agreed to meet her the next day at a location outside Millbrook. She warned me not to discuss the investigation with anyone in town and to avoid my scheduled wellness exam by any means necessary. She said, if my allegations were accurate, the people running this system would see me as a threat once they realized I'd been gathering evidence. I spent that night packing everything I might need into a backpack and a small duffel bag, preparing to leave immediately after meeting with Investigator Ramos. I took the vials from my closet and wrapped them carefully in bubble wrap and a small cooler with ice packs. I printed copies of all my documentation and put them in a folder along with USB drives containing the video and photo evidence. I wrote a letter to my parents explaining everything and saying I was sorry I couldn't tell them before leaving, but that I'd contact them when it was safe. I didn't know if they'd believe me or think I'd lost my mind, but I needed them to understand I hadn't just abandoned them without reason. I put the letter in an envelope and left it on my desk where they'd find it after I was gone. Then I tried to sleep, but mostly just lay awake thinking about everything that could go wrong and everyone I was leaving behind. I drove to the meeting location the next morning, a rest area 2 hours north of Millbrook. Investigator Ramos was waiting in an unmarked sedan, and she showed me her credentials before we talked. I handed over the vials and the folder of documentation, and she reviewed everything carefully while asking me questions about how I'd obtained the evidence and who else knew what I'd discovered. I told her about Devin and Megan and my brother Kyle, explaining that Devin had been affected by the injection and probably wouldn't be helpful anymore. She said she'd need to interview all of them as part of building a case, but that my documentation was strong enough to start with. She explained that investigating something this systematic and involving town leadership would take time, that they'd need to coordinate with federal agencies and get warrants and build an airtight case before making any arrests. She estimated it could be several months before they moved publicly, and in the meantime, I needed to stay away from Millbrook and stay safe. Investigator Ramos gave me contact information for a safe house program that could help me get set up in a new location while the investigation proceeded. She said the state would provide some financial assistance for living expenses since I was essentially a witness in protective custody. She also said I should avoid all contact with anyone from Millbrook, including family and friends, until the case was resolved. That meant not calling my parents or checking in with Kyle or trying to help Natalie. I had to disappear completely and trust that the authorities would handle everything. It felt wrong to run and hide while other people were still being victimized, but I understood that trying to fight the system directly would just get me caught and silenced. I asked how long I'd have to stay hidden, and she said it depended on how cooperative witnesses were and whether the people responsible tried to destroy evidence or flee. It could be 6 months, or it could be 2 years. I needed to be patient and trust the process. I drove west that afternoon, leaving Oregon and crossing into Nevada, where I found a cheap motel that didn't ask many questions. The safe house coordinator called me that evening with instructions about where to go and how to access assistance, but I decided to wait a few days before committing to their program. I wanted to make sure my parents got my letter and understood I was okay, and I wanted to monitor the news from Millbrook to see if anything changed. I found the local Millbrook newspaper website and checked it obsessively, looking for any sign that the investigation had started or that Dr. Harmon had been arrested. Everything seemed normal. The paper ran stories about the high school basketball team and an upcoming town council meeting about parking regulations. No mention of medical crimes or state investigators or missing teenagers. My 18th birthday came and went, without anyone in Millbrook knowing where I was. I was officially an adult and officially escaped from the system that had trapped everyone else I knew. 3 weeks after I left, the news finally broke. The Attorney General's office announced indictments against Dr. Harmon, Nurse Patricia, Principal Woodward, and 5 members of the town council on charges including conspiracy, assault, administering harmful substances, false imprisonment, fraud, and racketeering. The press release explained that for over 25 years, town leadership had operated a scheme to retain young residents by drugging them with medications that suppressed motivation and ambition. The drugs were administered through mandatory wellness exams disguised as legitimate health care. The conspiracy involved the town's medical providers, school administrators, and elected officials who all benefited financially from keeping young workers in Millbrook through reduced labor costs and increased property values. The investigation revealed that businesses in Millbrook paid town leadership for access to this captive workforce, essentially buying the right to employ people who'd been chemically prevented from leaving. State toxicologists confirmed the seized vials contained a mixture of psychiatric medications and experimental compounds that affected dopamine production and decision-making capabilities without causing obvious impairment. The arrests happened simultaneously across Millbrook at 6 in the morning. State police and FBI agents executed search warrants on the clinic, the high school, the town hall, and the homes of everyone indicted. Dr. Harmon was taken into custody while trying to destroy medical records in his office. Principal Woodward was arrested at home and charged with conspiracy for referring students to mandatory wellness exams, knowing what would happen to them. The town council members were charged with racketeering for operating an enterprise that deprived people of their civil rights and freedom of movement. News helicopters filmed the arrests and the searches, broadcasting images of armed agents carrying boxes of evidence from the clinic and town hall. National news picked up the story within hours, calling it one of the most disturbing cases of mass institutional abuse in modern American history. Reporters descended on Millbrook to interview residents and former residents about their experiences, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk about how they'd lost years of their lives to a conspiracy they never knew existed. The state health department set up a clinic in Millbrook to evaluate everyone who'd received the injections and determine what kind of treatment could reverse or mitigate the effects. Hundreds of young people showed up, including my brother Kyle and Devin and Natalie, all of them desperate to understand what had been done to them and whether they could get their normal brain function back. The doctors explained that the medications given during wellness exams had long-lasting effects on neural pathways related to motivation and goal setting, but that with proper treatment and therapy, most people could recover within 6 months to a year. Some effects might be permanent, particularly for people who'd been injected multiple times or had received higher doses. Kyle cried when he learned that his decision to come home from Seattle hadn't been his own choice, but the result of chemicals in his system making him feel sick and desperate. Natalie called me after her evaluation to say she was finally starting to understand why she'd given up on her dream so suddenly, and she was angry at everyone who'd known and allowed it to happen. The criminal trials started 8 months after the arrests and lasted for weeks. Prosecutors presented mountains of evidence, including medical records showing systematic drugging of minors, financial documents proving town officials profited from the scheme, and testimony from dozens of victims describing how the injections changed them. Defense attorneys tried to argue that the wellness exams were legitimate health care provided with good intentions, that town leaders truly believed they were helping young people avoid the stress and danger of leaving their community. But the documentation I'd stolen from Dr. Harmon's clinic showed they'd known exactly what they were doing, tracking behavioral changes and adjusting doses to maintain control. Emails between town council members discussed the economic benefits of keeping young workers in Millbrook and referred to the injection program as their competitive advantage over neighboring towns. One email from the mayor described the program as ensuring sustainable population growth and workforce stability for decades to come. Dr. Harmon was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Nurse Patricia received 15 years for her role in administering the injections, despite knowing they were harmful and non-consensual. Principal Woodward got 10 years for conspiracy and child endangerment. The 5 town council members received sentences ranging from 12 to 20 years, depending on their level of involvement and how much money they'd personally gained from the scheme. Multiple civil lawsuits followed, with victims suing the town, the clinic, the school system, and various businesses that had benefited from the forced labor arrangement. The total civil damages awarded exceeded $100 million, bankrupting Millbrook's government and forcing the dissolution of the town council. The state took over administration of town services, while Millbrook rebuilt its institutions from scratch with complete transparency and external oversight. I returned to Millbrook 9 months after leaving, attending the trials to testify about what I'd discovered and how I'd gathered evidence. The prosecutors told me my documentation had been crucial for building the case, and that without my investigation, the conspiracy might have continued indefinitely. I saw my parents for the first time since leaving, and they apologized for not noticing what was happening and for not protecting me and Kyle. They'd both been injected at 18 decades ago and had never questioned why they'd stayed or why everyone else stayed too. They'd just accepted it as normal and raised their kids in the same system that had trapped them. Kyle was undergoing therapy and starting to rebuild the ambition and drive the injections had suppressed. He'd been accepted to an online college program and was finally pursuing the education he'd lost years ago. Natalie was preparing to reapply to marine biology programs, determined to achieve the dreams she'd been chemically prevented from chasing. Megan Foster flew in from Denver to testify and was celebrated as the person who'd warned me to escape. She told reporters she'd spent 8 years feeling guilty about the people she'd left behind and wondering if she could have done something to expose what was happening. She was relieved that someone had finally gathered proof and taken action. Devin testified about his experience with the injection and how it had immediately changed his thinking and motivation. He'd recovered most of his baseline function through treatment, but said he still struggled with self-doubt and wondered which of his current thoughts and feelings were genuinely his versus residual effects of the medication. The psychological impact of knowing you'd been chemically manipulated was almost as damaging as the original drugs, creating permanent questions about autonomy and identity. Hundreds of Millbrook residents dealt with the same confusion and trauma. I spent my 18th year living in temporary housing in different cities, finishing high school through correspondence courses, and working part-time jobs while the investigation and trials proceeded. The Safe House program provided enough support to keep me fed and housed, but not much beyond that. I was lonely and displaced, missing my family and friends, while knowing I couldn't go back until it was safe. I watched the news coverage of the case and felt proud that my documentation had exposed such terrible crimes. But I also felt angry that it had taken so long for adults and authorities to believe that something was wrong. I'd been screaming that people were being hurt for months before anyone with power took action. The system that should have protected us had failed repeatedly, forcing a teenager to break into buildings and steal evidence because the proper channels moved too slowly or not at all. That failure made me determined to spend my future working in ways that prevented similar injustices. I enrolled in college the following fall, using scholarships and settlement money from the civil lawsuit to pay for a degree in criminal justice and public health. I wanted to work in systems that protected vulnerable people from institutional abuse, to investigate complaints that others dismissed as paranoid, to believe people when they said something was wrong. Millbrook had taught me that conspiracies were real and that trusted authority figures could commit horrible crimes if they thought they wouldn't be caught. It had also taught me that individual action mattered, that one person with determination and evidence could bring down an entire corrupt system. I kept copies of all my documentation from the investigation as reminders that doing the right thing often meant taking risks and refusing to accept easy answers. The experience had stolen a year of my life and changed my trajectory permanently, but it had also saved hundreds of people from continued victimization and ensured that no future teenager in Millbrook would be drugged into staying somewhere they wanted to leave. Kyle and I talk regularly now. He's 24 and finishing his engineering degree while working part-time at a tech company in Seattle, the city he'd tried to reach years ago before the drugs turned him around. He says he's finally living the life he was supposed to have before Dr. Harmon injected him with chemicals that stole his ambition and trapped him in a lumber mill. Natalie graduated from a marine biology program and works at a research facility studying ocean ecosystems, exactly what she'd planned before her wellness exam derailed everything. Devin is studying physics at a university in California, pursuing the dreams that were almost taken from him permanently. Megan still lives in Denver but visits Millbrook occasionally to speak at events about recognizing and reporting institutional abuse. She says watching the conspiracy get exposed and everyone responsible go to prison gave her closure she'd never thought she'd have. Millbrook's population dropped by over 30% in the 2 years after the arrests, as young people finally left to pursue the lives they'd been prevented from choosing. Some returned after finishing college or establishing careers elsewhere, deciding on their own terms that they wanted to live in their hometown. Others never came back, building new lives far from the place that had tried to trap them. The town slowly rebuilt with new leadership committed to transparency and accountability. They renamed the wellness clinic and completely reformed how healthcare was provided to minors. The high school established independent counseling services that weren't connected to any town institutions. Businesses that had participated in the forced labor scheme were investigated and several shut down permanently. Millbrook became a different place, scarred by its history, but determined to prove that communities could change and do better. I think about the 47 kids who graduated in the years I was documenting, all of them injected and controlled before they understood what was happening. Most of them recovered with treatment and pursued new opportunities, but some struggled with permanent changes to their brain chemistry and motivation systems. A few never recovered their full baseline function and lived with lasting disabilities from medications they never consented to receiving. Those outcomes made me angry at everyone who'd participated in the conspiracy and everyone who'd looked away despite having suspicions something was wrong. The system had failed those kids completely, and no amount of prison time for the perpetrators would give them back the years and potential that were stolen. Justice meant holding people accountable, but it couldn't erase the harm that had already been done or fully repair the damage to hundreds of lives. I returned to Millbrook for the 5th anniversary memorial service for victims of the conspiracy. The new town council had erected a monument listing the names of everyone who'd been injected during wellness exams, over 600 names spanning 25 years. The inscription read, "These residents were denied their freedom through abuse of medical authority. We remember their stolen futures and commit to ensuring such violations never happen again." I stood with Kyle and Natalie and Devin and Megan, all of us survivors in different ways of the same crime. We talked about what we'd lost and what we'd gained, how the experience had shaped our lives and values and careers. None of us would have chosen to go through what happened, but we'd all become people who recognized injustice and refused to stay silent when we saw systems harming vulnerable populations. That felt like something meaningful pulled from terrible circumstances, a way to honor the years that were stolen by dedicating our futures to protecting others from similar theft. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.